The intellectual conscience. I keep having the same experience and keep resisting it every time. I do not want to believe it, although it is palpable. The great majority of people lacks an intellectual conscience. Indeed, it has often seemed to me as if anyone calling for an intellectual conscience were as lonely in the most densely populated cities as if he were in a desert. Everybody looks at you with strange eyes and goes right on handling his scales, calling this good and that evil. Nobody even blushes when you intimate that their weights are underweight. Nor do people feel outraged. They merely laugh at your doubts. I mean, the great majority of people does not consider it contemptible to believe this or that and to live accordingly without first having given themselves an account of the final and most certain reasons pro and con, and without even troubling themselves about such reasons afterward. The most gifted men and the noblest women still belong to this great majority. But what is good-heartedness, refinement, or genius to me when the person who has these virtues tolerates slack feelings in his faith and judgments, and when he does not account the desire for certainty as his inmost craving and deepest distress, as that which separates the higher human beings from the lower? Among some pious people I found a hatred of reason, and was well disposed to them for that. For this at least betrayed their bad intellectual conscience. But to stand in the midst of this rerum concordia discourse, and of this whole marvelous uncertainty and rich ambiguity of existence, without questioning, without trembling with the craving and the rapture of such questioning, without at least hating the person who questions, perhaps even finding him faintly amusing, that is what I find to be contemptible. And this is the feeling for which I first look in everybody. Some folly keeps persuading me that every human being has this feeling simply because he is human. This is my type of injustice. Noble and common. Common natures consider all noble, magnanimous feelings inexpedient, and therefore, first of all, incredible. They blink when they hear of such things and seem to feel like saying, surely there must be some advantage involved. One cannot see through everything. They are suspicious of the noble person, as if he surreptitiously sought his advantage. When they are irresistibly persuaded of the absence of selfish intentions and gains, they see the noble person as a kind of fool. They despise him in his joy and laugh at his shining eyes. How can one enjoy being at a disadvantage? How could one desire, with one's eyes open, to be disadvantaged? Some disease of reason must be associated with the noble affection. Thus they think and sneer, as they sneer at the pleasure that a madman derives from his fixed idea. What distinguishes the common type is that it never loses sight of its advantage, and that this thought of purpose and advantage is even stronger than the strongest instinct, not to allow these instincts to lead one astray to perform inexpedient acts. That is their wisdom and pride. Compared to them, the higher type is more unreasonable. For those who are noble, magnanimous, and self-sacrificial do succumb to their instincts. And when they are at their best, reason pauses. An animal that protects its young at risk of its life, or that during the mating period follows the female even into death, does not think of danger and death. Its reason also pauses, because the pleasure in its young, or in the female, and the fear of being deprived of this pleasure dominate it totally. The animal becomes more stupid than usual, just like those who are noble and magnanimous. They have some feelings of pleasure and displeasure that are so strong that they reduce the intellect to silence or servitude. At that point, their heart replaces their head, and one speaks of passion. Now and then we also encounter the opposite, and as it were, the reversal of passion. For example, somebody once laid his hand on Fontenelle's heart, saying to him, "What you have there, dear sir, is another brain." The unreason, or counter-reason, of passion is what the common type despises in the noble, especially when his passion is directed toward objects whose value seems quite fantastic and arbitrary. One is annoyed with those who succumb to the passion of the belly, but at least one comprehends the attraction that plays the tyrant in such cases. But one cannot comprehend how anyone could risk his health and honor for the sake of a passion for knowledge. The taste of the higher type is for exceptions, for things that leave most people cold and seem to lack sweetness. The higher type has a singular value standard. Moreover, it usually believes that the idiosyncrasy of its taste is not a singular value standard. Rather, it posits its values and disvalues as generally valid, and thus becomes incomprehensible and impractical. Very rarely does a higher nature retain sufficient reason for understanding and treating everyday people as such. For the most part, this type assumes that its own passion is present but kept concealed in all men, and this belief even becomes an ardent and eloquent faith. But when such exceptional people do not see themselves as the exception, how can they ever understand the common type and arrive at a fair evaluation of the rule? Thus, they too speak of the folly, inexpediency, and fantasies of humanity, stunned that the course of the world should be so insane, and puzzled that it won't own up to what is needful. This is the eternal injustice of those who are noble. What preserves the species? The strongest and most evil spirits have so far done the most to advance humanity. Again and again, they relumed the passions that were going to sleep, and they reawakened again and again the sense of comparison, of contradiction, of the pleasure in what is new, daring, and untried. They compelled men to pit opinion against opinion, model against model, usually by force of arms, by toppling boundary markers, by violating pieties, but also by means of new religions and moralities. In every teacher and preacher of what is new, we encounter the same wickedness that makes conquerors notorious, even if its expression is subtler and it does not immediately set the muscles in motion, and therefore also does not make one that notorious. What is new, however, is always evil, being that which wants to conquer and overthrow the old boundary markers and the old pieties. And only what is old is good. The good men are, in all ages, those who dig the old thoughts, digging deep and getting them to bear fruit, the farmers of the spirit. But eventually all land is exploited, and the plowshare of evil must come again and again. Nowadays, there is a profoundly erroneous moral doctrine that is celebrated especially in England. This holds that judgments of good and evil sum up experiences of what is expedient and inexpedient. One holds that what is called good preserves the species, while what is called evil harms the species. In truth, however, the evil instincts are expedient, species preserving, and indispensable to as high a degree as the good ones. Their function is merely different. Unconditional duties. All those who feel they need the strongest words and sounds, the most eloquent gestures and postures, in order to be effective at all, such as revolutionary politicians, socialists, preachers of repentance with or without Christianity, all of whom cannot tolerate semi-successes, talk of duties, and actually always of duties that are supposed to be unconditional. Without that, they would lack the justification for their great pathos, and they understand this very well. Thus, they reach for moral philosophies that preach some categorical imperative, or they ingest a goodly piece of religion, as Mazzini did, for example. Because they desire the unconditional confidence of others, they need first of all to develop unconditional self-confidence on the basis of some ultimate and indisputable commandment that is inherently sublime. And they want to feel like and be accepted as its servants and instruments. Here, we have the most natural and usually very influential opponents of moral enlightenment and skepticism. But they are rare. Yet, a very comprehensive class of such opponents is to be found wherever self-interest requires submission, while reputation and honor seem to prohibit submission. Whoever feels that his dignity is incompatible with the thought of being an instrument of a prince, or a party, or a sect, or even worse, of a financial power, say because he is, after all, the descendant of an old and proud family, but who nevertheless wants to or must be such an instrument before himself and before the public, requires pompous principles that can be mouthed at any time. Principles of some unconditional obligation to which one may submit without shame. Refined servility clings to the categorical imperative and is the mortal enemy of those who wish to deprive duty of its unconditional character. That is what decency demands of them, and not only decency. Loss of dignity. Reflecting has lost all the dignity of its form. The ceremony and solemn gestures of reflecting have become ridiculous, and an old-style wise man would be considered intolerable. We think too fast, even while walking or on the way, or while engaged in other things, no matter how serious the subject. We require little preparation, not even much silence. It is as if we carried in our heads an unstoppable machine that keeps working even under the most unfavorable circumstances. Formerly, one could tell simply by looking at a person that he wanted to think. It was probably a rare occurrence that he now wanted to become wiser and prepared himself for a thought. He set his face as for prayer and stopped walking. Yes, one even stood still for hours in the middle of the road when the thought arrived, on one leg or two legs. That seemed required by the dignity of the matter. Something for the industrious. Anyone who now wishes to make a study of moral matters opens up for himself an immense field of work. All kinds of individual passions have to be thought through and pursued through different ages, peoples, and great and small individuals. All their reason and all their evaluations and perspectives on things have to be brought into the light. So far, all that has given color to existence still lacks a history. Where could you find a history of love, of avarice, of envy, of conscience, of pious respect for tradition, or of cruelty? Even a comparative history of law, or at least of punishment, is so far completely lacking. Has anyone made a study of different ways of dividing up the day, or of the consequences of a regular schedule of work, festivals, and rest? What is known of the moral effects of different foods? Is there any philosophy of nutrition? The constant revival of noisy agitation for and against vegetarianism proves that there is no such philosophy. Has anyone collected men's experiences of living together, in monasteries, for example? Has the dialectic of marriage and friendship ever been explicated? Have the manners of scholars, of businessmen, artists, or artisans been studied and thought about? There is so much in them to think about. Whatever men have so far viewed as the conditions of their existence, and all the reason, passion, and superstition involved in such a view, has this been researched exhaustively? The most industrious people will find that it involves too much work simply to observe how different men's instincts have grown and might yet grow, depending on different moral climates. It would require whole generations and generations of scholars who would collaborate systematically to exhaust the points of view and the material. The same applies to the demonstration of the reasons for the differences between moral climates. Why is it that the sun of one fundamental moral judgment and the main standard of value shines here and another one there? And it yet would be yet another job to determine the erroneousness of all these reasons and the whole nature of moral judgments to date. If all these jobs were done, the most insidious question of all would emerge into the foreground: whether science can furnish goals of action and annihilate them. And then experimentation would be in order that would allow every kind of heroism to find satisfaction. Centuries of experimentation that might eclipse all the great projects and sacrifices of history to date. So far, science has not yet built its cyclopic buildings, but the time for that too will come.